Now we're joined by James Van Smeerdijk from Atticus Now. So James, what challenges do you see Indigenous students facing?
The first thing I'd say is that the sort of thing facing Indigenous kids is the same thing that's facing most kids. It's the same context, and I think if you're young, there are some worrying signs for young people entering the workforce. Even before the COVID-19 crisis, 1 in 3 young people were unemployed or underemployed. Um, and this is going to be, there's obviously now worse and going to be getting worse. And secondly, the transition time from that young Australians take to get from full-time education to full-time work is sometimes 4 to 5 years. So it's a very long transition in underemployment. And looking ahead, about a third of the workforce is facing a fairly high risk of their jobs being destroyed by automation and going offshore. And as well, if you're young, wages growth has been sort of stagnating, but property prices have been increasing. So it's making things quite tough to afford. And the last thing, I guess, is if you are lucky to study, you've really got to pay off your HECS debt first, and that's okay if you're kind of a high earner. But if you're only in the mid earnings brackets, that's another thing. So there's a whole lot of things that are facing our young people today that are a bit different from the past and that are really, really challenging.
And how can these challenges be confronted?
There's a whole bunch of things you can do, but I think what's really important first is to understand, what's driving this, because if you can understand what's driving it, you can then take action. And so what is really driving this? And in my mind, it comes down to 3 things. And the first thing, which everyone knows, is this relentless globalization that's been occurring, with Asia emerging as the principal manufacturing centre of the world, and this growing international market for goods and services, which has propped up a lot of Australia's recent decades of growth. But this has really changed employment in Australia. Um, Employment in agriculture, mining and manufacturing has really fallen from, 37% back in the 60s to only 16% in the 2000s. And services has really grown from 63% back in the 60s to 84% in the 2000s. So there's this real shift into services, and the mix of services has changed as well. Much more in professional services, health and education, much less in wholesale trade and transport. So there's this incredible long-term shift towards services and really high value added work that can be done in a high cost country. So that's the first thing, globalisation. The second real thing to understand is technology. And everybody knows technologies are rapidly changing. You only have to live and look at your smartphone every day to see that. But the pace of change is actually increasing. So it's accelerating. And there's 20 different major technologies in the world that are, but in particular digital technologies, that are changing. And this is destroying a lot of jobs, but it's also creating a lot of jobs. And I reckon one of the best people on this topic is a guy called Professor David Autor from MIT, and he sort of says there's 3 types of jobs being created by this technology change. One is these frontier jobs, which are, installing and maintaining and deploying all these new technologies, and they're quite high paid. And then the other jobs that are being created are what he calls wealth jobs, which are low paid jobs servicing these new high earners, and that could be things like baristas and pedicurists or whatever. And then lastly, there's what he calls the last mile jobs, which is kind of like your Uber driver or your um, your Amazon warehouse job. It's like the supply chain for these digital economies, and they're quite low paid as well. So these jobs are being created and destroyed, and you've got to know, how to get the better ones. And the last point is geography. That jobs are not being spread around the country. They're created, the jobs of the future, particularly the high paying ones, are being created in certain places, the CBDs of major cities and other employment and innovation clusters, increasingly throughout those cities and occasionally in regional towns. So the geography is important too. So they're the three factors that are really driving this change.
What do you see in the future for those studying STEM?
Look, if you want to get one of these good jobs, there's a bunch of things you can do. And as you pointed out, one of the first best things you can do is study or train in science, technology, engineering and mathematics. So these STEM. Now, STEM jobs are not necessarily, you don't have to necessarily have an engineering degree. A lot of them are skilled trades jobs in STEM. But I know PwC estimated that 75% of future jobs will require some STEM proficiency. So, a lot of these new future-oriented jobs require STEM. And so if you can study or train in it, that is absolutely fantastic. And that's what everybody should be thinking about increasingly in the future, because it's these high-skilled, high-paying jobs that can exist in Australia. A lot of the stuff is either being offshored or competing globally, right? So, however, not everybody can do STEM or has had the opportunity to learn and to progress in STEM. And the good news is there are also a range of skills, non-STEM skills, that are really important to these future industries. And these kind of skills are things like creativity, critical thinking, learning, ability to learn and to communicate, interpersonal skills, your ability to manage your career, your self-awareness and confidence, and importantly, entrepreneurship. So you can do courses and there are employers who teach these skills, but you can also be a self-learner on the internet, and you can learn a lot of these things, and you can learn them through volunteer jobs or practicing. And so, all is not lost if you don't have STEM. These skills are also really important. The other point I'd make is it's really, really important to combine work experience with study and training. That is the way to get into your career is to mix work experience with your training and your study as you're going. Do internships, work placements, your jobs that you do, part-time jobs when you're a student, are really important stepping stones. So get into the workplace early and then try and segue into it and mix study with employment. And the last thing is geography. Like, be willing to position yourself so that you can be near to geographically where the jobs are.
How have you encouraged Indigenous students to further their education?
That job was done when I was at PwC, and it was working with an organisation in Shepparton called Canberra. Canberra is this fabulous Aboriginal organisation that looks to create pathways for Aboriginal young people through school and into training and jobs. And they do an absolutely fabulous job. And so over the years, I've helped them with a whole range of different projects to help them document their approach, assess, what sort of social impact and economic impact it has, and help to define the model so it can be lifted and shifted to other locations in Australia. And it's a fantastic model because it's really tailors their support individually to every kid and works out what can they do, what blockages can they remove, what support can they provide, how practical can they be to help that kid with those really important transition. And as we said earlier in this conversation, education and training is a fantastic pathway to employment, particularly for those good jobs. And it's really important to hang in there. And organisations like Canberra can be a great help.
But how do you see the current situation for Indigenous students? Do you think it's becoming better?
Look, anybody who looks at the Closing the Gap data, sometimes, if you're not careful, it can be depressing in the sense that a lot of the key indicators are still way behind the rest of the community and are not shifting fast enough. However, kids' retention at schools is is shifting. So there is some good signs that a lot of Indigenous kids are staying longer at school and moving into tertiary and education and training. And that's really, really important if you're going to equip yourself for the jobs of the future. So that's a positive sign. I'm also seeing some great signs at the supply end, if you like, the supply end of jobs in Indigenous commitments to employment by government and by major businesses, about Indigenous procurement policies that underpin the growth of Indigenous businesses and employment through government contracts and corporate contracts, and the growing band of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have a go at entrepreneurship and creating employment within their community. And so there are a lot of positive signs, but we need to work together with the Aboriginal community because it's tough and it's a tough environment, and I think we need to work in partnership together to achieve those goals.
Thank you so much, James, for joining us today. It's really important that we get this message out to our mob.